Hey guys, welcome to Polyphonic Tarot. I'm Prince of Cups 518, and welcome to another video on the swords. Last week I didn't get to do anything. I got my wisdom teeth out last Wednesday. Woohoo! So I've been in a state of recovery, finally feeling pretty good at this point. So we're going to do a new video today. And as I said, today we are on the Eight of Swords. We're almost done with the sword suit finally, too. This card, this is going to be a short one today because he does not have, and by he I mean Crowley, doesn't have a whole lot in the BOT for this card. This card is pretty simple. There's not a whole lot going on here. We've seen where the trajectory of the swords suit up until this point. We've talked a lot about how the swords are all about division and conflict, and the way that separate entities or personalities really interact with each other in the real world or in the intellectual world, particularly seeing as the sword suit, of course, deals with cognition and thought and willpower, and the power of choice, particularly. The will here being associated more with the idea of free will, I think, and the power of human beings to choose between good or evil, to choose between one or the other thing. That's really what the swords are all about. And the swords that are best usually are the ones that are focused on one thing as opposed to many things. As soon as we add the idea of multiplicity, as we've seen in particularly the Five of Swords and the Seven of Swords, we've seen how that has had detrimental effects. The Eight is not perhaps as dangerous or violent or dark or bitter as the Five would be, or perhaps even the Seven. The Seven isn't really aggressive, but it is not exactly coming from a good moral standing, the Seven of Swords, all the time. The Eight is really similar to the Seven, but it comes, in my experience, the Eight is less having to do with external sources or ideas or inputs changing our goal or the way that we put our energy or thought into something, instead of the Seven where all of those extra voices are putting us down and distracting us in that way. This is more, the Eight of Swords, which is the Lord of Interference, is more just mental clutter on the part of the individual. This is the card that really represents a person that is trying to think about too many different things. You know, one of the common phrases associated with this card is analysis paralysis, and I think that that's really apt. And I've always associated that with this card. You know, it's, of course, in the Waite tradition, it's the picture of the woman blindfolded in sort of this prison of swords in this kind of barren by the coast area, and there's, you know, a castle on a cliff in the background and all that. And of course, the traditional interpretation of that is that the woman is bound pretty loosely, and that she really could escape if she really wanted to, but she is unable to see that, you know, escape is that easy. So she, you know, the moral of this being that the condition of ignorance or in daily life is sometimes easier to free oneself from than it sometimes appears, because sometimes we get lost with all the clutter and all the details of things instead of focusing on what really needs to be focused on. And that's what this is all about here. In this card, this is mostly what he talks about. I almost don't even really need to read what he says. Basically, he just talks about the fact that this is Jupiter in Gemini, and so Jupiter in Gemini does give us a kind of beneficent aspect to this card. It does make it less evil than some of the other lower down the tree swords cards. It certainly isn't the Nine of Swords, and it certainly isn't the Ten of Swords, and it isn't even the Five of Swords, though it is related to the Five of Swords. And that's something to consider as well. There's a kind of contradiction in this card, because on one hand this card is on the Pillar of Severity and is related to the 5, as we just said. And so all of the cards on the left-hand part of the Tree of Life tend to have some element of restrictiveness to them. In some way, the energies of those cards are contained in some capacity. You know, with the 8 of Wands, it's a little harder to see, but we can see it in the fact that the 8 of Wands represents a burst of energy, and it's very short and doesn't have much longevity. You know, so it's contained. The 8 of Cups is a retreat from pleasure, is a diminishing of pleasure. It's a choosing to turn away from happiness and society and all those things. With the 8 of Swords, this is still an idea of confinement, and perhaps more a literal sense of confinement, given Smith's drawing of this card with the woman literally in confinement. But it's definitely a mental kind of confinement, and it's a thought kind of confinement. But on the same hand, or rather on the other hand, we have Jupiter in Gemini. And Jupiter is a planet in astrology that is usually associated with expansion and growth. And of course, Jupiter being Chesed on the Tree of Life is associated with bounty and plenty and good fortune and all that. So we have these very contradictory elements here, and he says that good fortune, however, attends even these weakened efforts thanks to the influence of Jupiter and Gemini. So he's saying that, you know, that it isn't all that bad in this card, but the will represented by the element of air in this card is very frustrated by just the diversity of things, and they have very interestingly chosen to represent this by using different kinds of swords, and he labels all of them, which is kind of silly, because I don't see why we need that information, but he does put what the different kinds are that are crossing this. So, and that's really all you need to know, is that all of these represent different strains of thought, or different ideas that may be blocking our ability to kind of see the forest for the trees, you know, and get at the heart of the situation and do something productive with that situation. So this is just a card of clutter. It's again, not a particularly bad card, but it's a card of mental clutter. It can be a card of some anxiety, but definitely not as much as the 9. It depends on what it is in context with. But it definitely represents someone who is stuck mentally. They have a lot of different options that they are weighing, and they are in turn not really making any decisions at all. And they're just stuck thinking about all of them and weighing the consequences of, you know, one choice versus the other, or, you know, the pros and cons constantly being weighed in this card. And it's just got a feeling of inertia. And it isn't until we get to the 9 where we sort of balance the energy, of this with the energy of the 7, and we get this just persistent evil feeling in the 9 of just anxiety and depression and feelings of weakness and emasculation and all those horrible things that the 9 tends to represent. And we'll of course talk about that at another time with our 9 of Swords video. But that's really all the 8 is. If you get the 8 in a reading, it represents clutter, confusion, being stuck, being unable to make up one's mind, having, in a similar way as the 7, having a lot of different influences at work, but mostly they're coming from within you, and they're not necessarily coming from without. Though the 7 can represent, obviously, inner senses of futility as well. So, obviously, all of these get to be interpreted based on context, you know. So that's about it. If you have any questions, leave them for me, please, in the comment box. I'll be happy to answer them for you. Don't forget to like, subscribe if you liked this video. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it, and love you all, and have a great day. Bye-bye.